Good afternoon. Welcome to the Cabarrus County Board of Education budget work session for Monday, March 30th, 2026. I'm Rob Walter, the board chair, and I'm going to call this meeting to order. So we'll move on to our opening ceremony. I'll do the introductions of my fellow board members, and then we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. So to my left, we have board member Shannon Lancaster, board member Catherine Moore, board member Sam Treadaway, our superintendent who will join us in a moment, Dr. John Kopicki. On my right, I have board vice chair Greg Mills, board member Pam Escobar, board member Melanie Freeman, and our board attorney William Eisenhower. And tonight our deputy is Lauren Elliott with Odell Elementary School. Thank you for being here. So with that, we move on to the Pledge of Allegiance. If you would stand with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, board members, we have one item on our agenda, but we need to set our agenda. I need a motion and a second to adopt the agenda for this evening.
So moved.
Thank you, Sam.
Second.
Thank you, Pam. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussions on the agenda? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Okay, our agenda is set. And moving right along, we'll move into the budget presentation. Oops. Which we'll ask Mr. Philip Penn to the podium. This is our budget update for fiscal year next year, 26-27. And you're going to give this presentation. Do you want us to stop with questions during the presentation or wait till the end?
I think I would prefer to take it at the end.
Okay. So let's do that. Let you go through the presentation, then we'll
Ask him a question before we start.
Dr. Kopicki.
Mr. Penn, could you explain to the board the supplemental stipend that went out today from the state to our teachers?
Yes, this is actually not part of tonight's budget presentation, but the state provides to almost every district in the state. I think literally the two exceptions are Wake and CMS. Incremental money to pay supplements to teachers. This is the only time there's state money involved with supplements. And then we take that money and we pay it out on a per teacher basis to all the teachers we have. And I think this year we're out to $1,025 per teacher. And this is not anything new. This has happened every year since I've been here. I know it's happened in the years before that. And so, you know, we always try to time it for the March paycheck based on when we receive the money from the state. So it's literally money in and money out. And the only thing that you can use it for is supplements for teachers. So.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that with us, and
Yeah.
we'll let you get into your presentation.
All right, terrific. All right. So just to publicly acknowledge all the folks that are participatory in this process, by my estimate, we had about 200 people involved in putting together the budget. It's a lot of work, as you might imagine, going through 45 schools, 15 departments, central office, and all the ancillary services that support putting this together in what will eventually probably be a $560 or so million budget. But let me just real quickly walk through the agenda and what we're going to cover tonight. I've got a couple of slides on background data and trends that I think are important context. We'll talk about the objectives of the budget and what that translates to for policy compliance, because there is a policy that we have that dictates what we do for the budget. Key budget drivers, what do we see out there sort of being the biggest components. We'll get into the continuation budget. Continuation budget means if you had the same thing when you open up the school doors next year, what would it cost you to operate that? Contrast that to expansion requests, which are true new, things between what we need to have versus what we'd like to have. We'll get into the 5 different components of the capital budget. We'll talk a little bit about remaining key dates with respect to this process, what I sort of view as the biggest risks, and then at that point I'll be happy to take questions and answers. All right, so just a little bit of background, and this is mostly for folks that may be viewing this for the first time. How are we funded? When we look at the revenue that we received in 24-25, or actual, when we look at what's budgeted for 25-26, the current year, you'll see, of course, that the largest component of our revenue stream is the state public school fund. Generally speaking, somewhere between 50 and 55% of our total operating needs. The local operating fund contributes about 20 or 25%. Federal grants in our district are fairly small, only about 3% of the budget. Local capital, that's construction, that's maintenance needs, those are devices, vehicles, things of that nature. You'll see, big variation between last year and the current year that we're in. That's all driven by the 3 large-scale construction projects that we have going on in 25-26. We have 2 what we call enterprise funds. Those are things that look more like a business than a government entity. Our school nutrition program and our Kids Plus program, each at about 4% and 1%. And then the last piece is special revenues and grants. That's going to be your Medicaid money. It'll be the indirect costs we recover from federal grants, smaller grant programs that we have flow through there, and a few other things. But all totaled, somewhere around $450 million for 24-25 actual, 25-26, 530, and the biggest difference, of course, is going to be sitting in that capital piece. So let's take a look on our next slide. One of the things we try to do is, in terms of benchmarking, is what does our spending look like compared to other districts in the state? And what I have here is both the statewide total average and what I would call the Big 12. Those are the 12 largest districts in the state of North Carolina. So if you're reading from left to right, state per pupil expenditures for us at about $7,400 per student. That puts us at 112th out of 115 districts across the state. Similarly, $829 per student, 108th for federal. About $3,400 per local for the local rank of 33 out of 115, which puts us at a total rank of 108 out of 115. So we're somewhere very close to the bottom. 2 years ago, we were dead last, 115 out of 115. I have highlighted in blue 2 districts that we like to compare ourselves to quite a bit. Johnston County, because they have very similar demographics, you'll see that their spending is around 97th in the state. And then Union County, because of their proximity and size, coming in about 110th out of 115. But equally important is how does that money get spent? So one of the things we like to look at for benchmark spending data, and this is the first time I've done this slide, was this year, is what percentage of our operating funds come from local. And you'll see in the 24-25 column, we're currently spending about 27% of our operating needs are being covered by the local budget. And you'll see how that compares to both the state and the other 2 counties, fairly similar. Then we looked at what's the percentage of local that's being spent at the school level, and more specifically, what we call a program code 5. Program code 5, if you read the state definition, is the direct interaction between a teacher and a student. So between our local operating funds, we spend about 55% in 24-25 of our local dollars at that level. Again, comparing fairly similarly to the other 2 districts and for the state. And then lastly, if we were to add together all the different funding sources that we have, how much of that would fall into that program 5 code? And it's about 3/4 to 80% of our funds are spent at that level, which suggests to you that we're actually spending the overwhelming majority of the dollars we receive at the school level on instructional activities with kids. What's the return on investment for that money? And this is a positive story, obviously, that we came in, as you know, 7th in the state with our grade level proficiency rankings. It was the first time that we were in the top 10. And if Carl Sand was in the room, he would tell you that going from 35th to about 15th is about the same amount of effort to go from 12th to 7th will be about the same amount of effort to go from 7th to 3rd, right? Because you get incrementally closer to the top, it's harder and harder to knock other people out as you try to get closer to that #1 ranking. One of the things we always start with when we're putting together a budget is what does our student population look like for next year? You can see the historical growth in the blue at the top. 25-26, we did not have much growth in the student population. For 26-27, we're anticipating that to be about 83 students, as you'll see there, pushing us up to about 35,300 and change. More importantly, though, if you were to look at the projections through 2033 to 34, we're anticipating adding about 1,300 students over the long term. One of the ways I started thinking about that number was if you think of an average school size of around 800, that's a school and a half that we need to come into the system over that time frame to accommodate that number of children, right? So how does student growth impact local spending? Because there's, I believe, a belief out there that it's the responsibility of the state to pay for the needs of the schools other than construction. That's not true. So even if we had additional teachers that are state funded because of growth, the local operating budget's still going to grow because of the 13% certified supplement that we currently pay to our certified staff. And I'd like to remind people that 13% actually increases to about 17% when you factor in our retirement costs and you factor in our payroll taxes that had to be added onto that. And if additional teachers need to be locally funded entirely, we're going to absorb 100% of the cost within the local operating budget. Now, the state, as you know, does not fully cover our student transportation costs. So if the student growth gives rise to additional routes or buses that we need to have, there's going to be an incremental cost to the local operating budget that picks that up as well. And then each new student typically requires supplies and materials, all of which is going to be incremental to the existing local operating budget that we have. The state gives us about $30 per student in terms of supplies and materials. That's a pittance. You can imagine how quickly you can go through $30 per student. At a local level, the funding level that we provide for each student to the schools is about $100 per student. So, order of magnitude difference. Okay. Objectives and policy. So the objectives are going to be very similar to what you've seen if you've been with me for the last couple of years going through this process. Create a budget that supports the ongoing strategic plan. Create a budget that aligns resources where they're needed most. As I like to say, equitable is not always equal. You got to be able to push resources where they're needed most. Make sure you're presenting the budget in a way that the material is accessible to everybody, not just finance people. And be transparent about what's a need and what's a want. And we've got clear delineation between those in this process. Don't sacrifice the long term to solve a short term need. That's one that's personally important to me. And then try to work aggressively where you can to mitigate the cost and be more efficient as you go through this process every year. Okay. So taking you through sort of at a high level budget process and how this aligns with Board Policy 81. I promise I'm not going to read every bit of text on the page, but the black text that you see on the page is the verbatim policy. The red text is how we respond to that policy and make sure we're in compliance. So as an example, when we're considering long-term facilities, you as a board just approved the long-term capital plan a couple of meetings ago, right? So there's a direct connection between that process and the budget process. When we go through the process to make sure that we're implementing all programs and activities of the school district, you've seen the monthly budget forecast we provide to you. We've provided some of the enhanced monthly reporting now that we started doing this year. We have a new finance committee and the exhibits that are associated with that for the first time, so I think we checked that box pretty well. We have a BOC budget retreat that we participated with at the end of February, talking about what we anticipated being some of our needs going into the 26-27 year. We did conduct about 60 meetings with schools and departments as we went through the budget cycle, making sure that we heard what the principals and the department heads were asking for and understood what that need. We can read an Excel exhibit like anybody else, but it always helps to hear it directly from the person that's involved with the work. And then lastly, making sure that we have a public hearing, which is scheduled for a week for tonight, that we go through. All practical and legal sources of income. I'm glad they made sure we said it was legal. Cash management practices and our sales tax refunds, making sure that we're maximizing all of those as we go forward. We spend a fairly good amount of time on the cash flow activities through my department now, and making sure we're shifting money to where we can get the highest interest rate on our quote-unquote excess cash. These last two, I would say, are more ongoing. They're not directly tied to the budget. How do we assess the needs of the school district and the revenues and expenses? We do that pretty much every month, if not every day. And making sure that we're identifying the most cost-effective means of meeting the school district's needs. That is, again, an ongoing process. So we evaluate new vendors as we go through RFPs, as we go through all the different things out there, and see, is there a better way for us to be doing what we've been doing? All right, budget process. There was a calendar that went out during December. We have a finance committee on March 26th that saw the preview of this budget. We have the work session tonight on the 30th. The hearing, as I said, is scheduled for a week tonight on the 6th. The adoption meeting, if all goes well, is scheduled for the April 13th. That's going to be sent to the Board of Commissioners on April 14th, the following morning. So, okay. With that as a preamble, let's kind of get into what sort of the key assumptions are for going into our next school year. Well, first of which is an assumption of around a 3% increase for legislative increases beyond what was baked into the 25-26 budget. Now, there's no magic to that 3%. That 3% came from a consensus forecast among the Big 12 CFOs. What do you plan on using? We agreed on 3%. We don't know what the legislature's got planned. If you see what the governor's put out and a few others have put out, it could be very different than 3%, but we needed to pick a number. We don't know the extent of the benefit cost increases for next year. We've only been told it's going up. And as you might expect, we're going to talk about it a little bit. It's both the retirement side and the healthcare premiums have seen dramatic increases over the last 20 years in terms of what it costs us to provide personnel into the system. Every time I hear somebody make a reference to a $50,000 teacher, I like to remind them that's not a $50,000 teacher. That's a $65,000 or $70,000 teacher, depending on whether they're taking healthcare benefits as well, right? And that's something we have to factor into all our budget processes. In the absence of any other number, we try to use an inflation rate that's sourced from a third party. I like using the Congressional Budget Office because it's nonpartisan. If you look at what their expected rate of inflation is for 26-27, it's 2.4%. We try to do our staffing based on, again, the funding and arrears model we've been talking about for the last 2 years and around our internal estimates around what the growth in student enrollment's going to be. And there is a fairly robust teacher allotment process that goes on as a joint effort between finance, our partners in HR, and all the different schools to make sure they understand what their allotments look like. And that is a process that is not one and done. It's something that evolves over time so that we do the initial work and then they go back and look at their schedules to make sure the schedules can run effectively. And if there are adjustments need to be made, we make those adjustments. And then anything lastly, that's what I would call a one-off development with a significant impact. And I like to use the example of utility rate increases. We're going to talk a little bit about Duke Energy having 2 rate increases that are going to affect its budget cycle and what that translates to for utility costs. So to the extent that we know big things that have not happened yet, we always try to incorporate that into the budget as well. Okay. What do I see as kind of key budget drivers for 26-27? We talked about the lack of a state budget at this point for 25-26. I think we're all about to write off 25-26 is not happening. But we don't know what our biggest cost drivers are going into next year at this point. We don't know what the state legislature's got planned for salary increases. We don't know what the retirement rate is going to be, and we don't know what the medical cost rate is going to be. They just said it's going to go up. Okay, well, so we've had to make assumptions around what that looks like to make sure we try to bake in enough of additional cost into the system so don't we have a shock loss if they come in with a much higher increase than we were anticipating. We've talked a little bit about potentially leasing computers for students and staff going forward. If we lease, that's approximately $1.5 million a year for the next 4 years. The alternative is an upfront capital cost that we buy 6.4 million of the devices. You'll hear me say that I'm agnostic about what direction the county takes with respect to how we fund those devices. For me, there's some advantage to leasing, I believe, because interest rates have become a lot more cheap than they were 2 years ago when it comes to that type of work. There's also something to be said for what is a fairly short-lived capital asset. If you think about computers only lasting typically 3 to 5 years, there's probably some value into doing leasing as opposed to doing long-term debt or any other kind of issuance to pay for the devices through an outright purchase. As I mentioned, state per pupil funding for supplies is very anemic. We back check that all the time to make sure that we've got the right amount of instructional supplies and software that's there. And software, as you're going to see on the next couple of pages, is going to make up a big difference in terms of what our budget costs are going to be. Unfortunately, software tends to grow at a rate that's significantly higher than what we see with the overall rate of inflation. That's very typical that once you're sold a software product, they like to continue selling that product. And as you know, it can be sometimes difficult to move away from a software product that you've used for a while and then is effective. School resource officers, we had a sharp and unexpected decline in the state grant this year. We've also got increased personnel costs in both of those agencies. So we're going to drive it into what is a proposed $200,000 increase in local funding for SROs. What those two agencies shared with us at this point is that the average cost per officer ranges anywhere from $105,000 to $120,000 per officer. And that's just the person. It's not actually the equipment or the uniform or the car or anything else. And so we reimburse both agencies right now at the state-driven rate of $91,000 per officer. And what they've said is that that's not sustainable. So what we've proposed within this budget is an increase in the reimbursement rate to $101,000 per officer for the 38 officers that we're responsible for providing. You may be asking the question, well, where are the other officers? Those are provided in kind to us either by CPD or the county. So there's a total of 45 officers, but we're responsible for coming up with the funding for 38 of those. Lastly, utilities, I just mentioned a few seconds ago, we do know that there's 2 confirmed or filed, which means they're probably going to get it. Rate increases for Duke Energy Electric, and that's the largest provider that we have for utilities. The impact over the course of this budget is going to be approximately $263,000. Transportation, after curtailing expenses this year as much as possible, we're proposing some increased funding to replace the inventory of maintenance supplies, repair parts, tires and tubes for our transportation fleet. They've cannibalized where they can to get through this year, trying to keep their expenses low, but you can only do that for so long before you got to get to fleet readiness before we start the new school year. A little bit of good news on insurance. Property rates have stabilized compared to where we've been, but we are going to have growth in that cost because of what they call exposure growth. Exposure growth is what you have, something that's new. So we've got 3 new schools that are slated to come online that we've got to account for in our insurance. We've also got contents coverage. So contents is literally everything inside the building. That typically rises at about an ordinary inflation rate of 2 to 3% a year, but as they do that, it increases the cost of your policies as well. Maintenance, repairs, and equipment. This is in our facilities and maintenance department. There's 2 different components. We're proposing an increase in $200,000 of funding for the actual repair work that goes on. but we're also looking to increase their equipment by about $245,000. And I've kind of highlighted a couple of examples of what that kind of equipment would be: compressors, grinders, things that take care of floors, welders and trailers. It's all the things that sort of make that operation go. Now, typically when we've gotten into the situation where we needed more money for repairs, I've asked them to curtail their equipment expenditures. It's a controllable cost to a degree. Eventually, if you do that for enough consecutive years, they need to come back and they say, look, we really need that money because we're starting to run out of things to actually do the work. And I can totally understand that. So you'll see an increase of that when we talk about the FMD budget in a little bit. Lastly, workers' compensation. We've got a couple of bad claims that are going to linger into next year. We've adjusted the workers' comp budget line to reflect that. I come out of a background with the number 6 workers' comp writer in the country, and we used to have a saying that the only good claim is a closed claim, right? So we want to make sure we get to a place where those claims are adequately addressed within the budget. So this is a new slide from last Thursday. This is what I call your elevator speech slide. If somebody was to ask you the question, what's driving the budget for next year? Here you have it, right? So these are your top components. It's not every last dollar, but it's certainly the biggest drivers we just talked about in the last couple of pages. You'll see both the dollar amount increase in 26-27 and the impact of the budget increase overall, right? Okay. I'm not going to comment on all those because we just mostly talked about it, but you have that for your reference. EC student growth and spending. This always continues to be a very volatile area of the budget. I know you've seen this exhibit a couple times now before, and this is the one that sort of rolls forward to 25-26. But the way to think about this, if you go all the way down to the far right column, you'll see all the services that are provided to our EC students above their general education costs. You'll see the total number of students that we're supporting in the current year, and our cost per student of a little over $10,000 per student. Well, and somebody's going to question, well, don't you get money back from the state? Yeah, we do. We get about $26 million back, which is capped at $5,500 per student, and also capped at 13% of your student body. Now, right now, we're running at 12.3%, so we're not quite at the cap, but you can see it from here. And I kind of question the system where you don't have the right amount of resources being provided by either the state government or the federal government to adequately address the needs of those kids. So that means, as a practical matter, is I'm pulling money out of the general education budget to make up the difference, or I'm assigning the cost to local, as the case may be. There's a number of different proposals that are out there around changing the funding model going forward, but until it happens, you can't count on that type of model change happening at this point, right? Okay. So we'll get to what I call the punchline slide. What does the local operating budget look like compared to what we had for 25-26? So you may recall that the county breaks it down to 3 main categories. There's instructional services, which is kind of the big umbrella, and there's everything that doesn't fit into facilities or technology. So of course, instructional services is the biggest piece. The recommended funding request for next year is 88.6. That's up 7.6. Facilities at 16.6, up 1.7. Technology at 9.1, up about $2 million from the current year. Now, the contingency that we had in the budget for 25-26 was on our side of the budget. That was that almost $7 million. We're proposing a little bit of a change in the structure for how we do that for 26-27, which I'll explain in a second. But on a gross level, at that subtotal line, 114.4 versus 105.8, up 8.5 overall. Okay. Now, what the county had was a large surplus coming out of their 24-25 year that they're still debating how to use the surplus best. But one of the proposals that's out there that seems to have some traction is setting aside a total of $6 million for the school systems, and all of them, not just us, of which we would be about $5 million to cover our raises for going into next year and our other personnel increases. In addition to that, as you know, we receive local fines and forfeiture money as revenue. I'm suggesting we go to 1.1 million versus 900,000 this year. Our collections this year have been strong, and I think that's supported in the 1.1. On the flip side of that, though, interest on our investments, on our cash, I expect to go down quite a bit next year, mostly as a reflection of the lower cash balances we're investing, plus the interest rates that have dropped on the short end of the market. Special revenue, we're going to talk a little bit about what's in that component in a few seconds, but if I were to take out from the 114.4 million, the 5 million in that contingency, the 1.3 million for the other local revenue, the almost 9 million for the rubber special revenue, leaves me with a net county funded continuation request, that yellow line, of 105.2 versus 101.6. That's an increase of 3.57 million, or 3.52%. And there's an asterisk there for a reason. If you look at the lower left part of the page, what that says is that without the benefit of that $5 million, if that plan goes away, the increase looks more like 8.43%, just to be very transparent about the difference between the two, okay? All right. So how is the revenue changing? As I mentioned, fines and forfeitures I'm expecting to go up by about 200,000. I expect interest on investments to go down by about 146, but local to be up overall 54,000. Medicaid I'm going to call about the same, but I'm becoming more optimistic about what we see this year, but I'm not going to count it until we actually see it. Sales tax refund came in much stronger than we expected this year, so I feel comfortable about the increase we're proposing there. No change in the other miscellaneous income, and then the indirect cost recovery, that's a variable rate. So when we apply the variable rate we're anticipating for next year against all of our federal grants and the other grants that we're allowed to do, we wind up with a little bit of a drop of about 150,000. So total for all revenue not supported by tax dollars is about a decline of about $28,000. Okay, so that is factored into the budget estimates for next year. So one of the things we talk about when we're looking at staff, as we sort of rolling into like the major components of this, is over the last couple of years, as you know, we've tried to get more precise around how we allocate all of our positions across the district. We've looked at, when I first got here, almost 300 certified teachers were paid for out of the local budget, and in my discussions with other CFOs, they were surprised that the number was that high, that other districts were sort of maintaining a lot closer to the statewide allotments that we see come through. So over the last 3 years, we've done some very intentional work around making sure we understand what the scheduling looks like at each of the 3 different tiers of the schools, and making sure we have a very robust process when it comes to the allocation process. Now, what I would tell you is that 194 in the current year for 25-26, that's probably the bottom. I don't think we can go lower than that. And part of that is because we make certain choices at a local level in the things that we support. Program choice and a number of other ones, the risk-based adjustments that we do with certain of our allotments, all contribute to that. Now, when we looked at what we have for coming in for next year, the 83 additional students, and technical corrections, that's just a fancy way of saying the way we rounded everything. So if we had a school that came out at 38.3 teachers, it would round out to 38. If we had that same school came out at 38.7, we rounded up. Well, this year when we added up all the rounding that came through, we needed a couple extra teachers because of the rounding process, right? But what we're carrying in the budget for next year is that 198 teachers, and you can actually see it here on this page. So 198 certified staff at $43,000 per teacher. That's the assumption we're making for an A0 teacher. 8.5 million, that's your top line on there. Teacher supplements looks way out of proportion of the teachers, right? But remember, we have to pay teacher supplements out of our local funds. So that reflects, it's reflected in the 19.3. Other compensation and step movement. Now, this requires a little bit of an explanation. When we look at other compensation, that means you effectively have 2 different people in the role at the same time. You have somebody who's out on a leave, somebody who's getting paid, still getting paid, but we've asked somebody to do a planning period buyback or do some additional work that they're going to be compensated for, which means you're now compensating 2 different individuals to do the same work, right? So at that point, we need to say, well, how does that factor into the budget? Now, in past years, through turnover and particularly through vacancies, we were able to cover those costs. But if you've been keeping track of how low the vacancy rate is this year, we just can't make that assumption going into next year's budget. The numbers are a little bit too tight. Similarly, you may recall when I said at a board meeting recently, we got burned on the step movement that the state told us to pay didn't follow with the funding that came on after it. So I'm a little bit concerned about making sure that we have adequate money in the budget to make sure we can address that movement going into next year. Retirement, we're planning an increase above what the current retirement rate is. FICA obviously stays constant, but the retirement rate does not. Now, I've understood now finally why they call it a retirement rate, not a pension rate. And the reason is you have post-retirement medical that's built into that rate. So anybody who is here and hired before 2021 receives post-retirement medical. So all the issues that they're having within the regular medical system affects the post-retirement medical as well. So all of the growth that you've been seeing in that number really is tied much more to the retirement, the portion that's medical related, as opposed to the portion that's pension related. Healthcare, again, in the absence of any kind of guidance from the state, in the current year, we pay $8,500 per employee. I've increased the assumption to $8,750 per employee, and I'm hoping that's enough. We'll have to see what that comes out, but they don't actually announce rates until July, long after this budget process is closed. Okay. Similar processes as we go down through all the classified personnel. You'll see, we break this out into 3 different buckets to align with the county is used to seeing from us. So we'll walk down the salary information, we will have other compensation, and again, this is the same issue where we've got people being paid overtime to cover things that we have absences in the building that need to be taken care of, right? You'll then take it down to the same thing, the payroll taxes and the retirement rate, the healthcare rate, all the way down to the bottom. In total, 323 classified staff, and a total of 521 total people on the budget, FTEs for local, at a total cost of about 6.5 million is the differential. And again, the biggest piece in the changes there are going to be your pension rate, sorry, keep doing it, the retirement rate, and the change in the salaries as well. Okay. So what does it look like in terms of major changes that are happening within the non-personnel costs? And again, we're going to go through this 3 different ways. The instructional first, I'm just going to call out the big changes that are on the page. Computer software and supplies, we talked a little bit about computer software being a major driver of this coming budget cycle. Within contracted services, that's where our SRO cost lands, so that's what the major driver is in that increase. If we were to come down to licenses and fees, that's associated with new vehicles that we have proposed in the budget. If you were to come down to the line on mobile communication costs, that's down because we had a miscoded piece of the budget that got transferred that you'll see on the next page. And then lastly on this page, you have another major change in property and casualty insurance, which we've already discussed. When you look at the supplies and materials with an outsized increase, that's where that prior information on when I said we had to transfer out of mobile communications, that's where that's landing. But if you were to look at, for instance, tires and tubes being up 90,000, you may recall that I mentioned we had to put additional money into this budget to make sure transportation was okay. So we've added money there. We've added money on repair parts. We've added money on gas and diesel. And frankly, I don't know if that's enough. You know, we don't know duration of what's going on in the Middle East right now, but we're trying to take that a day at a time. I will tell you it's creating a stress point in the current year budget, as you might expect, right? I'm very grateful that we only have 8 weeks to go on this transportation needs in the main part of the school year. But overall, an increase of about 6% or 1.6 million in the non-personnel side of instructional. Similar exercise on facilities. You'll see when we talked earlier about the building and maintenance and repairs, and these are the kind of repairs that you can't defer. Something breaks and it needs immediate attention. That's where a lot of that work comes through, that it's in the system. If you were going down about halfway through the page, you'll see equipment. That's again all the equipment that they use within the trades and the custodial staff to keep up with the school needs. Workers' compensation, that's actually where those claims sit, is in the facilities and maintenance area. So you'll see the $100,000 change there toward the very bottom. And then lastly, you'll see we've taken vehicles completely out of the operating budget. I've always opined that it really didn't belong in the operating budget to begin with. Vehicles belong in capital, and that's where you're going to see them when we get to that in a little bit here. Okay. Technology. Biggest change on the page, and it jumps right off at you, is the lease computers. So again, we're recommending that for computers we go to a leasing strategy instead of a purchase strategy. Footnote at the bottom just makes it clear that if you go to leasing, you're committing to it for at least 4 years, right? It's like you have that obligation going forward. It's not like you only get to pay 1.5 and then walk away from it. If you attempt to do that, they'll come back and ask for their computers back, right? That's how that goes. But again, I think there's some value in looking at leasing, given where interest rates have gone, and given the fact that this is a fairly short-lived capital asset, then it makes more sense to lease than it does to buy. And also, as you'll see at the very end, it creates some additional cash release that the county needs to come up with less cash on a current period basis to fund that. All right, expansion requests. So to be clear, this is new. Yeah, 3 additional social workers. You've probably seen that request in one form or another for the last couple of years. We want to try and address the students' mental health needs as a result of that. Section 504 specialists. This one was a little bit interesting to me because I wasn't aware at how extensive the 504 work is that we have in the district right now. We process in the neighborhood of about 1,500 504 requests each year, which is an extensive amount of work that's currently falling on the school counselors at this point. So one of the proposals is to have somebody work with these 504s on a regular basis and free up the time of those counselors, particularly at the high school and the middle school levels, and let them get back to the mental health needs of the kids. Radios for the bus fleets. This would largely replace the cell phones that we have in the district. Right now, we are dependent on cell phone technology for communicating with our buses. As you know from traveling around to various parts of the county, cell phones don't work. It's an unreliable communication piece. So what we're talking about is adding radios onto the buses that would replace most of these cell phones so that the transportation planners would have direct contact at all times with all the buses. That's typically how that goes. When you look at the ongoing piece, that's been reduced for the estimated savings that we would have on the mobile phones that are associated with most of our vehicles. So right now, there's a cell phone in each bus. We would retire most of those cell phones. The only cell phones that we would keep would be the one lead driver from each school would have one going forward to be able to be reached after hours if there's something that needs to be addressed after hours. Okay. Given the changing demographics of our school district, there's a request for an additional Spanish language interpreter going forward. And additionally, under student learning and engagement, this is a comprehensive math curriculum. You know, the board passed and we started moving into a much more comprehensive ELA curriculum last year. This is the next logical step in that, is looking to something comprehensive across all the math curriculum that we have. It is similarly scattershot. We need something that looks a lot more comprehensive. There's a consistent experience from school to school as we go forward. Within our teacher compensation, we're proposing a certified supplement increase to 13.25% from 13%. That 0.25% is $462,000 when you factor in, again, the retirement costs and the payroll taxes on top of that. District-wide, and this one is personally kind of important to me, it's called Droplet software. You know, again, Droplet is the proposal that we saw. I'm not saying that's necessarily the vendor we would go with, but this is something that gives us the ability to take all the different paper forms that we circulate around the district. And there are a lot of paper forms that we circulate around this district. Digitize them and build a workflow that this form is then repeated down to the next person for approval or sent back as the case may be. We saw a demonstration of this a couple of weeks ago. I was thoroughly impressed with this, and come to find out in conversations with my other Big 12 colleagues, we might be the only district that doesn't have this. So one of the things we're looking at, particularly with my department, I'll use that as an example, I've got 4 major retirements coming next year. We need to figure out a way to become a lot more efficient about how we move things around this district, and pushing paper is not going to get us there. So I think this is kind of an evolving industry standard. Corporate's already there. I think we're starting to see governments catch up pretty quickly. So again, I'm not necessarily wedded to the vendor itself, but that's the one I'm aware of. Lastly, given the fact that we're supporting about 45,000 devices across the scope of the district, there's been a request for an additional IT technician that we're supportive of, and some additional network security software. You might not know that government and healthcare are the 2 most targeted industries for fraud. And the reason is that's where the money is. There's a lot of money that moves through government, there's a lot of money that moves through healthcare, and the data that's accessible in those systems are pretty robust in terms of a bad actor getting their hands on it. And there is a wide assumption that government does not keep up with the needs for intrusion protection, right? So they're perceived soft targets would be another way of putting it. We obviously have a lot of systems in place to make sure that we are hardened on that infrastructure, but there's a couple of things that we would like to add to continue to make sure we're staying as best as possible 1 step ahead of the bad actors. Let me transition out of the operating budget real quick to get into capital. Capital this year, you're going to see 5 different categories for it. Capital outlay, construction, deferred maintenance, and this is going to be the hybrid list that we started talking about for the first time this year. Equipment, which covers a number of different things, and then vehicles. That's the first time we've broken out vehicles in the capital budget. A lot of the capital, as you might imagine, is being driven off the long-term capital plan that the board approved at its last meeting. So when we get into what's capital outlay, these are things that we know are identified needs, mostly for equipment and other things at the school level. This list, when I first got here, was very central office dominated. And one of the things we've been intentional about is trying to make this more school-centric going forward, right? So you'll see the things that are on here, as an example, the marching band uniform refresh. The 2 schools that are up, they would be first on the list. The uniforms, I believe, are 23 and 19 years old, respectively, right? So these are things that have been around for a while, and they're starting to show their age. Fine arts instruments, we always have money in this part of the budget to make sure we're adding fine arts instruments and replacing the ones where it's necessary to do so. School level equipment needs, this is one that I sort of have taken over within my group to look at things when we ask the question of principals, What do you need that your instructional supply funds aren't paying for? This is where this comes back into the budget, because one of the comments I heard from one of my staff 2 years ago is, gee, we see the same things on the list all the time, and nobody ever does anything about it. Well, that doesn't make much sense. Why do we bother asking the question if we're not going to do anything about it? So for 2 years now, we've tried to cleave off a little bit piece of this budget to address those needs, and you'll see the full list of that in the appendix. Furniture. If you've heard us talk about the Furniture Committee, which I have served on for the last 2 years, the Furniture Committee goes out and visits 8 to 10 schools over the summer. We look at their furniture needs, we build up a list, and we try to match up either what we have to our existing inventory of furniture, if we've got spare set aside somewhere at a closed school, or we look to do new. And what we've done for the past several years, and it's working out pretty well, is this rotational process where, and this is mostly common area furniture. If you think about main office or library and media center or the cafeteria, it's not the classroom level stuff. It's more the stuff that gets a lot of action during the day that we need to address in this manner, where we're chewing off a little bit at a time. Media center court collections, that's technology managed. That seems like kind of an odd place for media center collections to be managed, but it's more about a person who used to head up curriculum instruction, then went to C&I, went from C&I to technology. When he left and the new person came into technology, we just decided to leave it there with support of the C&I. But it's a way of making sure that we're adding a little bit each year to the library and media centers for all of our schools. Kindergarten play-based materials, this would be for 5 classrooms going into next year. The last 2 are actual curriculum-related materials. These are materials that we're expected to have a life of at least 5 years, which is why they turn up on a capital budget this way. You'll see it for both pre-K and for EC adaptive curriculum. This is ones that turned up that we thought were worthwhile and a way to utilize this money, as the county has been fairly consistent with this $1,020,000 that they've given us for the past several years. In terms of construction, the next piece of the capital budget, as you know, we've got 2 different schools, new ones that are proposed going into the next cycle. The remaining costs are there versus what we've spent so far. A fairly precise number on the Northwest Cabarrus High School replacement because of the bidding processes that we just completed, as you're aware of. So a total of just under $184 million. Deferred maintenance, I am not going to go through this entire list, but if you may recall last time from budget cycles, we used to have 2 separate lists. We had a list of projects that were over $500,000 each, and we had a list of projects that were under $500,000 each, and it just caused a lot of confusion in terms of how these projects got funded. So in 25-26, we changed that practice to what we call the hybrid list. Just take the 2 lists together and figure out what your top projects are, that's what's reflected here on these 3 pages. So you'll see a total of about just under $18 million. And just to kind of stress this point, if you think about us having, I'll say $360 million because the math is easy. If you're spending $18 million a year, it takes you 20 years to get through a list of $360 million. You're really just staying current, right? Because the buildings are going to continue to age during that process. But this at least kind of gives you a pathway to say we're going to take out some of these big projects over time and continue to chip away at it. When we talk about equipment, it has a number of different things. One of the things that we're talking about is a bus camera system upgrade. This would be a pretty significant change from what we have currently, is that you can remote access all the cameras live in the buses now. You don't have the ability to do that currently. It would also give some additional storage capacity onto the cameras, which I think are important if you need to go back and recall some footage over a particular day. 3 of these marked with asterisks are computers. They're staff devices that were not refreshed 2 years ago at a total cost of about $1.9 million. I want to say that's roughly 2,000 staff devices that would be replaced. Student devices, mostly Chromebooks, and you'll see the grades that are assigned there. Roughly 8,000 devices at just over $4 million. And then iPads at the bottom. This is a downscope request from where we have been buying iPads. It's a total of 700 for $408,000. But those are the devices that appear on the list this year. Paging and intercom systems in 25-26, you may recall we started addressing paging and intercom systems that weren't working to the level that we needed them to work. We came up with this hybridized digital and analog components that would work fairly effectively and fairly efficiently. We were actually able to do 15 schools with the amount of money that we were allocated for 25-26. We want to continue that work going forward, but we've scoped it back down to 8 schools. We basically committed to, we said 4 to 5 year cycle to get them all done. So we've taken that down with what was roughly $800,000 in 25-26 down to $425 for 26-27. Security cameras at $800,000. That covers a number of different things. It could be either cameras that need to be replaced. It could be cameras that need to be installed new to cover blind spots, but often it also includes the storage that needs to go with the cameras. If you know, video is very data intensive to store. Our objective is always to have 30 days worth of video feed available to us to go back and recall. So that's just the ongoing need to make sure that's all maintained. Interactive displays, again, we've downscoped this a little bit from where we were in 25-26 to a total of $470,000 that will replace approximately 170 interactive displays for the schools that specifically asked for them during the budget cycle as we went through their presentations to us. Total for the equipment of just under $9 million across all those different needs. And lastly, on to vehicles. You'll see it's mostly transportation, facilities, and technology that are requesting vehicles. I won't go into all the detail, but in your appendix you have the ages and the amount of mileage on the vehicles we're looking to replace. I'll call out FMD. There were 6 replacement trucks as an example. Of those 6 trucks, 5 have more than 250,000 miles, 1 has more than 200,000 miles, and the county replaces its vehicles at 150,000. So we're not really following suit with how the county replaces them. But I do feel pretty strongly that all the vehicles should be built into a capital budget, not an operating budget, which is why you see it laid out here this way. So if you'll permit me, a little bit different kind of chart than I've usually done in a summary before in the past. In the yellow, in the right, on the left, rather, if we're leasing in the computers, the continuation request would be 105.2. The expansion request would be 2.6. Going down through the capital improvement items, and I'm going to specifically call out the equipment one at 2.5, gets you a total funding request of 314.6. Okay. Move over one column. That if you're going to purchase the computers instead of leasing the computers, the continuation request drops by a little bit because you don't have the leasing cost. Expansion request stays the same, but now your equipment line in capital goes up by $6.4 million to reflect now you're going to need that capital to buy the computers instead of leasing them, right? Takes your total funding request overall to $319.4 million. Coming out of the Finance Committee, they thought it was good to show what the comparison was to 25-26 funding requests. You can see the 101.6. Expansion was fairly minimal. Capital outlay, new construction, and then down to maintenance projects. Again, that was a very different approach that we looked at maintenance because we had 2 different lists that we had submitted, not one list. And then we did not break out vehicles from the other equipment. That was a combined $6.9 million that we asked for last year. So the total request in 25-26 funding was at $341.8 million that you see at the very bottom. Okay. So again, going left to right, 26-27 request if we're going to lease the computers, 26-27 if we're going to purchase the computers, and what do we have in the current school year. Okay. Remaining dates, we've got the work session, of course, is tonight. We'll have a public hearing on this presentation next Monday. We'll have a meeting with county leadership, and by leadership I mean the folks that work for the county. It's not the elected officials, so they can become familiar with our budget. We're targeting for a Board of Education adoption on April 13th, which would then tee up a presentation of the Board of Commissioners that Dr. Kapicki and I would do on April 14th. And at that point, our process is largely done. There's not a whole lot left for us to do between middle of April and middle of June when we find out what funding we've been awarded. What do I see as risks? Obviously, a continued state budget stalemate is going to be problematic no matter what. The conflict in the Middle East, particularly if it's prolonged, we're going to have a direct impact on both diesel and gas prices, but we could have an indirect one on inflation, given how much goods are transported that are dependent on all that energy cost. Any kind of further reduction in grant resources, particularly on competitive grants, there's just no predictability to some of that stuff that we deal with. And then, as you might expect, any kind of a sharper than expected rise in the number of EC students that we serve, or an increase in their severity needs, or a combination of the two. I would say those are probably the big 4 in terms of budget risk going into next year. With that, I'm going to get some water, and then I'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Penn. It's a lot of information, a lot of work that went into developing this one. Again, it is a budget, it's an estimate. It certainly shows a large need for our school system. So when you're ready, board members, I know we've had a lot to digest. There's even a large appendix as well, so it goes into some detail on some of those items. But opening it up for questions. Go with Pam.
So thank you, and the 200 people behind you. I appreciate that. So sort of highlights then is that if we decide to do leasing, if the county likes that, we're asking for less money than we did last year.
Correct.
So going to our new expansion request.
Yep.
3 social workers and then those 3 504 specialists. Where do we envision they would go? I know a lot of them split duties across schools, so would we just be adding to that?
Dr. Kubicki wants to answer that.
Yeah, so in regards to the social workers of 504, what we would do is in consultation with Amy Jewell and the student services team, which would include Amy Lauder and Betsy Naval, Karen Howard, and the team to assess where they go to assign them. Because even though we would be adding the expansion of the social workers and the 504 specialists, which would be a great addition to help our teachers and pick up the amount of work, Phil made a good point with over 1,500 504 requests. You can just imagine the amount of work that is. Just assessing that data, we would take a look at where it would be a best fit. I can't sit here and say they'd go here, here, and here,
Right.
but we would assess where the need is greatest and go from there.
And I just appreciate this as far as being consistent with what we asked for in our legislative. Just social workers aren't the same as school psychologists, but again, when you look at mental health, our school social workers are picking up a lot of that lift. So I just appreciate all the work that they do, and I would like for them to have the support that they need. And I know we're still not hitting the ratios that is required by their professional organizations, but again, it is a need, not a want. Looking at the radios for transportation, I like this because of a safety component. At the end of the day, we want the people who are driving the bus to be reachable and they can get help if they need help. So I like that. I think that's a creative solution. I also think it ends up saving us money long term with cell phone rates. Looking at teacher increase. I appreciate that there's a 13.25 request at the county level, that there's an increase. I appreciate, here we put 462, that's what it would cost total. What does that look like for a teacher? What kind of increase, if anything? Because the reality is they've been receiving nothing.
Right.
And then cost of living is 3%. Isn't even if the legislator goes back and fixes what they've not done,
Yeah.
it just doesn't sound like a lot.
You're correct, and it's not. And I'm smiling because Mr. Mills asked me that very question about a week and a half ago.
Okay.
So of course it's going to vary based on what the individual is making. But if I was to use the average salary that we have across the district, it winds up being about $13 per paycheck.
Okay.
Yeah.
And because we're asking for less, if the leasing, is there wiggle room? Could we go to 14? Is that just, has the county indicated that there's just no appetite for that? The reality is our teachers are working second and third
Sure.
jobs because you cannot afford to live on what they're making right now. And again, I just come off of a weekend where all these teachers are giving their time to volunteer and do all these things. They're pouring into our kids, and I wish we could do more.
Let me respond to that this way. We try to build a budget request that we think is as reasonable as we can make it, right? Across a number of competing needs. As you might have seen going through this, it's hard to pick and choose the spots. Like what would you pick as the number one, right? Student safety probably first, teacher compensation second, and you start building stuff that way to say, well, what's the most reasonable request that we could put in? Now, if the board decides, Phil, I want to see that number at 14%, we'll change the number, right? I mean, and what we asked for doesn't tell us what we get funded, right? So the ask is what we think it seems reasonable alongside the remainder of the request that we have in here. But if you collectively as a board say, change the number and make it 14%, we'll change the number.
And I just want to say thank you to our county commissioners and county staff. I had the opportunity last week to go to their budget education, what they do for the public, and I recognize that none of this is easy. And so, again, we have to think about, what it takes to deliver quality education to our kids. Safety, absolutely, like you said, is up there, but also teacher satisfaction with Cabarrus County. And I guess the one thing, I appreciate the comparisons earlier with Johnston County and with Union County. I would be curious, I know Mecklenburg is asking for a big increase for their teachers. I know it's not fair to compare us to them because there's a whole different ball game, but do we know what Union County is getting or where they are in their process?
I know through a relationship with that CFO, they were planning on increasing their supplement going into next year. I have not seen the actual proposal that they've made yet.
Okay, I would be curious about that for next week. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you, Pam. Anybody else? Greg?
I'll just add on to that subject since we're on it. This isn't really a question, it's just kind of a statement. As I did some research around what other districts are doing for teacher supplements, I consider the fact that our teachers are apparently performing very well because our students are number 7 in the state for academics. And then I look at the resources that should be available in this county to compensate those teachers, and we're 8th for median household income, and we're 9th or 10th for assessed property values. So it seems like our teacher compensation rate should be somewhere in that lower half of the top 10, right? And it's interesting that number 7, if we were tying it to our academic performance, that number 7 position for teacher supplements is Johnston County, which is one that correlates demographically very closely to us. So I would like for us, in the long term, to say that our goal is to get into that top 10 area for teacher supplement, and then run some analysis to figure out what's it going to take every year in order to get that, and how long will it take us to get there. I've made an attempt at this, and it's not easy math, but I'm coming at something around 0.8% every year for 10 years.
Okay.
I don't know if that's right or not. I would need somebody more, somebody better at spreadsheets than I am to make sure that I'm doing those calculations correctly. But I definitely think something in that 1% range moves the needle, whereas 0.25 doesn't.
I'm just curious, if you tolerate a question, when you factored that in, did you assume the other counties were moving during that 10-year period?
That's what made it so difficult. So there's 2 moving targets in it, right? You've got to sort of estimate where the other counties are going, where they're going to go over that time span, and you also have to factor in the fact that a lot of those are based on a percentage of the state salary scale, which means the state is probably going to increase theirs in that period of time too. So trying to factor for both of those things was what made that very difficult. But like I said, I think I'm getting close on it. I might send my spreadsheet to you and let you look at it and let me know what you think. But I do think, bottom line of that, I would lean closer to 1% on that, just so that we're not moving backwards relative to other school districts. And I think that's fair to our teachers. When we look at what the wealth should be available in this county, comparatively, and when we look at the performance that we're getting out of our students, if we're trying to say we want to compensate teachers based on the work that they're doing, that number speaks very highly to what our teachers are accomplishing, and I would like to see them compensated for it. If I go through just a couple of these questions real quick, and we've got time to do this next week, I don't want to spend too much time on it. Is legal under contracted services?
Yes.
Okay. This was one that kind of bothers me a little bit. You said that the state told us that they were going to fund the step increases, and then they didn't fund the step increases.
Correct.
And so my question is, how can they not fund the step increases? They set the salary scale. That's not our local decision.
That is correct. Although there's a piece that then comes into play that we then need to make a decision at a local level. Do we follow what the state told us to do with respect to the state-funded employees, right? So you remember, again, different funding buckets for personnel. As we've done every year in the past, we followed suit with the state, only to find out later they only gave us, they didn't give us any increase for the step increase, right? They didn't give us any piece of it. And if you may recall, I think at the last board meeting I said that a piece of the step increase money came through because they swept some other account and gave us about 25% of what they were supposed to, right?
But was that additional cost in step increases, was that going to happen under the existing salary scale, or were they responding to a proposed salary scale?
So the existing salary scale, what a step increase means is that you go from step 5 to step 6, right? And there's a reflection in that compensation for that teacher when you do that. All of which is fine, very standard practice. Well, come to find out that when they passed the continuation budget, or whatever they passed, it didn't actually include the funding piece that went along with the step because it wasn't considered a continuation.
It seems like at some point they would have to go back and
Fix that.
fund that, right?
Right.
Like legally speaking, they talk about an unfunded mandate. Like they
That's
wrote a
correct.
salary scale and then they didn't compensate us for the salary scale that they wrote.
Welcome to my world.
Okay. Let's see. We found legal. Hey, bus radios, is that less expensive than cell phones on every bus?
It is a little bit more expensive on a net basis, right? Because what I factored in there on the ongoing piece of 55,000 reflects, okay, what's the gross cost of the radios? Take away the savings that you would have from getting rid of the cell phones, and what you're left with is about 55,000 a year. It's a hair more expensive than the cell phones that we have now, but a heck of a lot more reliable than trying to rely on cell phones in part of the county.
Are the ongoing costs less because there's no, like, a radio just works over the air, you don't need a service, right?
You pay for a service like you do anything else, right? But yeah, there's an
It's
ongoing
not like a
cost.
CB radio where I can just talk over the public airwaves?
No, not quite like that. It's a dedicated frequency that you're operating on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, your droplet software.
Yes.
I would really love to hear that that's going to benefit EC teachers and streamline their processes.
I know for sure it'll just streamline CTE will be one of the most attractive areas because there's an awful lot of certifications that go through the CTE. So in talking with the vendor and talking with a few other districts, that's one of the areas they highlighted that I was surprised by. I had no idea how much paperwork flowed through that area.
Yeah.
So I think the sky's the limit in terms of like what we can get creative with in terms of converting forms like this. They gave us a live demo in one of our actual forums and it was very impressive in the meeting. And again, I use the term droplet just because it's the one I saw. We would have to go through a process to sort of RFP some of this work. But I'm personally excited about it because I think it leapfrogs us a little bit compared to the way we push paper around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of paperwork in EC too. If we could streamline that, that would be amazing. I know we can't remove some of that stuff because it's required by statute, but if we can make it easier, that would be outstanding. Classroom furniture, where is that at? You said we do the core furniture.
Yes. So in my time frame here, we have not done a major classroom furniture update in any of the schools, probably as a result of the fact we're doing new construction right now. So we cannibalize what's in the old school. It goes into warehouse. I couldn't tell you where the warehouse is. I just know there's a warehouse. That we store all this furniture, and then as schools identify needs, we will sometimes pull stuff out of the warehouse that is still very usable furniture to make sure it gets needed by whatever school has requested that furniture. But yeah, you're right. There probably would be at some point, absent some other means of getting there, at some point you probably have to replace classroom furniture as well. But we've not gotten to that stage yet.
Having been married to a teacher, our staff in the building do an excellent job of putting pieces together from other furniture and making very old furniture continue to be workable in the classroom. But it seems like that should be a line at some point, just like we have to replace everything else.
There will probably be a time, maybe not in my time frame, but at some point we'll have to probably have a line item in there for that.
Okay. And then the last question for me, and maybe just a suggestion, is when we get to the leasing versus purchasing computers, we had some questions about this at the Finance Committee meeting the other day, and having marinated in it for a little bit, I think I'm a little bit more clear, but what I think would be helpful to me and maybe some other people is if we could have, in the next couple of weeks, like a cost of ownership analysis for both plans across the lifespan of those devices, if that makes sense.
Okay.
If that's not too much work.
Yeah. My brain's just spinning through how to lay that out, but yeah, I can work with Mr. Stain on that.
All right, appreciate it.
Okay.
That's it for me.
Thank you, Craig. This side. Shannon?
Well, I was going to ask about the local supplements, but Pam and Greg asked my question, so thank you. The other thing is the retirement costs on your elevator pitch slide.
Yeah.
What do we pay retirement? I always assumed that was a state expense.
Only if the person, the employee, is state funded. And that's only if It's a position allotment, not a dollar allotment. So let me show you something, because I think it kind of drives into this process. I'm going to hop back into what I believe is the last page of the appendix, because it tells a pretty interesting story. Here it is. Oh, there it went. So this is a historical look at what's happened in terms of benefit rates and wage increases over time. This goes all the way back to the 2003-2004 year through the current day, right? FICA, pension, payroll taxes, those are pretty straightforward. Those are stayed constant, right? But what does not stay current, look at the retirement employer cost. That is our cost. It's gone from what was once 3.42% to 24.67% currently. I'm anticipating it's going to be a little bit over 25% next year. And what's driving into that is you have a defined benefit plan that still exists for teachers, and you have the post-retirement medical for anybody who was hired before 2021. This state was very late in going away from post-retirement medical. I will say that much nationwide, right? So if you think about what's driving into those costs, it's the regular medical cost inflation for people that are approaching retirement age. And you know, without sending any kind of age discrimination, people who age have higher medical costs. So there's more of a concentration of services and costs within that aging group as you go forward. So you'll see we're now paying 25 cents on the dollar for every dollar of salary for anybody who's not state funded in a position allotment going forward. And unfortunately, when you put that side by side versus the insurance employer cost, we've gone from paying $3,300 per employee to paying close to $9,000. What I put in for an estimate for next year is $8,750, and I'm wondering if it's going to be enough. Because if you continue to read what's going on with the healthcare plan in the state, they're still concerned about have they done enough to make it sustainable over the long term. So unfortunately, we're in a position we don't control that. It's handed to us that way. So any of the 500 or so people that are locally funded, these costs arrive directly into what we support. And then if there's any costs that we have that flow back into local, that even if they are a state-funded employee, take the certified supplement I mentioned before, right? I have to add the retirement cost and the payroll tax cost on top of that, which is why 14% looks a lot more like 17% to me when I think about that total. If we were to go to 14% going forward, it would look a little bit more like closer to 18 probably, without doing the math in my head real quick. Yeah, okay. You're welcome.
Sam?
Just want to applaud the additional social workers who are an extension of our school into the community. I really like the 504 specialist. In my bouncing around and doing interims, one of the areas I saw was, I won't say inconsistency, but I think with specialists, that's what they do all day. You'll have more consistency. And then the last thing is I like the idea of the radios on the buses. I can't tell you how difficult it is to drive a bus and make a phone call, which we don't want them to do while they're driving, but even then, to hear they can't hear the phones. The radios are much more practical. We actually tried that years ago, but I'm sure the technology is a lot better now, because I think the range was an issue or something like that. But I think these are excellent ways that we can better serve our community.
Thank you, Sam. Anybody else? Melanie?
I want to thank you for all the work, and I thoroughly appreciate the Finance Committee meetings, because that really helps us to get a preview of what's going on, and we do riddle him with questions during that committee meeting. Is there software for these radios?
Is
Would
there
that be
software to the radios?
You said there's a service that
Yeah.
we would pay.
Not that I know of, but I don't know enough of the technical details of the radio proposal, but I'll be happy to follow up on that for you.
Well, I was just wondering if there's
Yeah.
something that we're going to keep up with that
Yeah.
too, as well as with the updates for the other stuff.
Okay.
And I can't find my notes right now, but there were a couple things that you said that we might run in excess with that could go into fund balance. We've been talking about building our fund balance
Yes.
again.
Yes.
And do you remember what those categories were that possibly we could
Not specifically, although I think I made the comment in the Finance Committee meeting that we're trending closer, more directionally close to a surplus than a break even. Mostly because at this late stage, it's very unlikely the state's going to take any action on salaries. And even if they did, it would have to come in the form of a non-pensionable bonus, because we're too late on contributing pensions back retroactively, which would mean that you wouldn't have the pension cost associated with whatever that bonus worked out to be. But based on what I know now, and the only variable I continue to throw out there is what diesel price is going to look like, is I think we're trending toward a surplus to rebuild fund balance coming out of this year.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Melanie. I just had a couple questions. Mostly on slide 21, if you can explain the $5,000, because that's a key part of our making a reasonable ask, I guess, to the county.
21?
21, it's an offset, right? So you're deducting that from the $114 million dollars that we.
Oh, all right, now I understand. Okay.
How is that working?
Okay. So the county, to my knowledge, is not taking a vote on this, right? Until
The
they
what?
do.
Say that again?
The county has not taken a vote on this yet.
No.
No. But what's been proposed is potentially using upwards of $6 million for all the county schools, of which we would probably benefit to the tune of $5 million. KCS would get a benefit, charter schools would get a benefit. That's how I came up with the $5 million. Of taking money out of their 24-25 surplus and designating it for use in 26-27 as an offset to the compensation cost changes that we have going on and anticipate into next year.
So above the 3%.
Well, that it would reflect well, keep in mind that it would be above 3%, but there's other things that would change, healthcare costs and the retirement costs, regardless of whether or not we had a raise. But it would help to offset the costs that are in here to that tune.
Without hitting our budget here.
So one time.
Without hitting our budget that we've got here.
Yeah, correct.
So it's a protection or
So
insurance.
in other words, it would reduce the gross amount of 114.3 on this slide to what would be 109.3 instead, if we're able to utilize it that way.
Right, but we're only going to use what we
need.
so if
That's
we don't
correct.
spend it all.
And by doing it that way, it's actually a pretty smart move on the county's part, so we can actually see where the raises come out. This way, they don't appropriate something to us now that then needs to be shared with the charters, potentially unnecessarily. So, but it's driven off the fact that they had a surplus and potentially could use it this way.
Right, and it's a good way to help and protect us
Absolutely.
from
Yeah.
unexpected expenses.
Yep.
And it lowers our ask to within their estimate. I guess they're preparing for a 4% or something.
I think
And
4.5.
we're right close to that. So.
Yep.
Okay, the next one was slide 24. And I missed it. There's a health slide 24. Is that what it is? 25?
This is my 25.
So one with the next one. Yeah, that one. Up, back one.
Oh, that one.
You have a decrease in the healthcare. I missed the.
Not the entire population of 198 is taking benefits.
Okay.
So we try to model off what is in our current year for the number of people that take it. And if you think about it, some of our A0 teachers are a little bit younger and still qualify under mom and dad's healthcare system. So there's no reason to take the benefits here. So.
Okay, our next slide. And that was the one that sticks out to me where
Yeah.
we have all our other staff and our salaries jump by 3 million, but our number of staff don't.
Correct. So one of the things that we have locked in on is number of vacancies are down significantly compared to last year. That's reflected in the anticipated total cost for 26-27. But more significantly is we are seeing turnover that is actually leading toward people coming in at a higher level compensation than people going out. That is a reflection of how we changed to our classified salary structure, that it was based on a 30-year career. And if Dr. Williams was in the room, based on conversations I've had with him, what we're seeing is people coming out of a corporate environment with a significant level of experience, coming to work in local government and school districts because it's the safe place to be right now. There's a lot of turnover and a lot of uncertainty that you'll see in the private sector right now, that there's a perceived safety coming into government, and we're seeing, as we pay for these individuals coming in with significantly more experience than what we would expect, having to pay that differential as well. But we model this up based on actual employees that we have right now and how they're being compensated. But again, it's really those two factors that are driving that.
I was just saying it stands out
Yeah.
as a pretty significantly. Almost done here. So on our expansion requests, those go into certain categories, right, if they're approved?
That's correct. We would
So
have to line those up.
We would add those numbers to those
Yeah,
categories?
that's correct.
And those are all operating?
Yes.
And I think that's all I had for this.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question of the board?
Yes.
As you know, we've got a public hearing coming up next Monday. Is it the desire of the board to move the compensation for the certified supplement to 14%? Because I can reflect that in next Monday's presentation if that's the desire.
At this point, you can give us two options.
Okay, you can do that too.
Can you do that? Two options?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, let's prepare two options.
It'll make for a little bit of a messy summary slide, but I'm happy to do it that way.
Yeah, but,
Okay.
okay, anything else on the budget tonight? So again, the public hearing is next week, so the public who are watching tonight or seeing it online, review the budget. If you want to reach out to us with comments, if you want to speak to us, that would be the time to do so. And I don't have anything else. So with that, we would need a motion and a second to adjourn. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Shannon. All in favor of adjournment, please say aye. Aye. Okay, we will say goodnight to our listening audience and see you next week.